So this week's prayer email kind of acts as an accompaniment to what we're going to talk about here today. So if you did not see that, you haven't read through that, you might want to check your email later today. It might help connect some dots, might help make a few things more clear. Then again, it might not. Anyway, so we are, in case you haven't realized this, we are about 2 months away, a little less now, from our official relaunch, replanting of Direction Church as a house church network. And if that hasn't been apparent to you, it has been for me. But there's been a lot of things that have been different. There's been a lot of things that ended up being different, and I'm sure that there will continue to be things that are different and will be different from what we expected. And that's just the nature of church planting, but also in the nature of wanting to follow Jesus wherever that might lead. And so, in fact, this isn't in my notes, but right now it just popped in my head was when Paul was like, hey, I'm going to go into Bithynia. And the Spirit's like, no, you're not, and go back. And so I sometimes feel like that's what God does with us. Like, we have an idea, we're going to do it for a little bit, and God's like, yep, you did that, now we're going to do this. But we were doing that. Yeah, I know, you're doing that, but now you're going to do this. So all that to say, there are going to be things that are different. And so when I've been thinking about and processing both for this home gathering and the next months leading up to this relaunch together, there's been a lot of things I've been trying to process through and pray through and think through and work through to figure out how best to utilize these gatherings to hopefully give us a commonality and a common ground to move forward together. And so as I was processing and studying, it really became pretty evident to me, I guess, that today what we're going to be talking about is the subject of faith. Now, I do think we just read a bunch of texts just a little bit ago. And I'm not going to go through, and I'll mention this again, I'm not going to go through and read all of the stuff again or all of chapters 10 through 12 of Hebrews, but I really encourage you to do so at some time. But as I was studying for this, there's a lot of points that came up. I could have taken a bunch of different angles and a lot of different points, but what I quickly ended up just settling on is just one. And it's just one thing that I think I've heard a lot about, but it still needs to be talked about, and that's this. It's the obstacle to faith, fear. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more today. So right off the bat, I need to ask you this question. Is there something that you fear? And I'm going to give you a moment. But think about that, whether it's, and this is a question that could be probing and difficult because sometimes we readily acknowledge our fear, but sometimes we try to suppress and ignore and pretend we're not afraid. Regardless of which situation you're in, I want to ask you that question. Is there something right now that you fear? Fear can be a pretty complex emotion. I was reading actually about a psychologist the other day. In his book, he was working with someone through their anxiety and their fear, and the closer that they got to actually finding a path forward toward healing, the closer they got to that, the worse the symptoms became. And actually, the individual they wanted to stop. It was too much, and I feel like that encapsulates and really highlights the complexity, but also like the difficulty of dealing with fear. Actually, there's a book that I've been reading called Anatomy of the Soul by Dr. Kurt Thompson, and he speaks about the risks and rewards of being known. I mean, and I think it honestly applies and connects to faith pretty well, because the kind of faith that God calls his people to have and to live out involves the intimacy of being known, not only by him, but by our brothers and sisters too. And so this is what he writes. This is kind of a lengthy quote, so I'm going to put it up here for you. He says this: the problem arises when you, like Julie, are afraid, and I use the term afraid deliberately, that you are wrong. Of course, given that you may pay so little attention to what you are feeling, you may hardly notice your fear and defend against it by finding more ways to support your belief that you actually do know that you know what you know. When you keep your relationship with God exclusively fact-based and rational. It's easy to make judgments about others and yourself. Such judgments reduce your anxiety and increase your sense of safety and protection. However, this way of being also has the curious effect of increasing the isolation you feel, both from others and within your own mind. If you allow yourself to be known by God, you invite a different and frankly more terrifying experience. You are now in a position of vulnerability. If you permit others to know you, they can make their own assessment of your worth. They can react to you. You give them power to be affected by you, and in so doing, to affect you. You grant them the option to love you or reject you. In essence, you must trust another with yourself. However, I will argue that it is only through this process of being known that you come to know yourself and learn how to know others. There is no other way. To be known is to be pursued, examined, and shaken. To be known is to be loved and to have hopes and even demands placed on you. It is to risk not only the furniture in your home being rearranged, but your floor plans being rewritten, your walls being demolished and reconstructed. To be known means that you allow your shame and guilt to be exposed for this point, in order for them to be healed. To be known is one of God's passions. While He desires for us to have the experience of being known by Him, just as important as His desire to experience being known by us. This is not simply for our benefit, as if He's not affected by us. He desires to be known by us as much for what it does to Him as for what it does for us. And that is why we need to be right about God. And that is why the need to be right about God often gets us into trouble. As a friend of mine once told me, Christianity is not about being right. It's about being loved. And I when I read that, I was floored. I've been thinking about that for a little bit, and I'm going to continue to. But it also reminds me of another book that I read once called The Sin of Certainty. And the subtitle is why He desires your trust more than He desires you to be right. The reason I wanted to share that excerpt from that book with you is because I feel like it pertains to faith really well. It really does. I'm convinced that fear is arguably the most talked about, yet also the most ignored vice in the Christian life today. And what I mean by this is that I have heard, I have seen, I have known of sermon after sermon after sermon preached on the topic of fear and overcoming it, yet the application of these messages just honestly, it seems, and maybe it's not actually what happens, but it seems like the application of the messages just gets accepted as optional, because I see this as the number one cause of debilitation in the Christian life today. It enslaves people with anxiety. It causes doubt and makes it even more believable than the truth. It elicits anger from people as a last-ditch effort to regain control. It forces people into isolation, like Dr. Thompson was talking about, away from the community they were created to be in. It slowly steals and sucks a person's life right out from under them. And as we journey into this next chapter as a church together, I truly believe that the enemy has already, is now, and will try to continue to leverage this thing called fear as often and as much as he can to derail your and my faith. The stats, honestly, this isn't lost on me. The stats of about the number of people who have entered into church planting in the past, but that are today not even following Jesus or even not around anymore, are staggering. It's absolutely staggering. And this is why I believe it's so urgent that we revisit this here today. That's why when I was thinking through where do we go next before we get to this big relaunch, where do we go? What should we talk about? What do we need to invest in together? Not to hear this teaching and then an isolation process. You can do that too, but this is something that we need to be in community processing. We need to be able to lower down our walls and trust one another, saying, "Hey, I want to be vulnerable and this is going to suck for me, but I'm trusting you to love me well even when it hurts me and hurts you." That's what I think God's calling us to. And I think that's why I felt so convicted that that's where we needed to go. This isn't really going to answer, like today's not going to really be an exhaustive kind of look. It's not going to answer every single question that you might have or that you could possibly ask, but my hope is that it will serve, honestly, as the proverbial can opener for, like opening up the can of worms or whatever. Like the idea of this person has a lot built right there. Like you touched a button and now they're going to go off and talk about this forever. I want this to be that. I want this to be the can opener that opens up the conversation of faith, that we can share. This is what I'm struggling with. Can you help me? Can you pray for me? Can you love me and accept me as I'm at right now, but love me and accept me enough to not let me stay here because I need your help. God's put you in my life. What can you do to help me, and how? Also, don't just stop there, but also what can I do to help you? God's placed me in your life. And so I hope that this is the conversation, this is the can opener that starts and continues and explodes this conversation for this community in a way that we have never experienced before, because how we fight fear is together through faith. Now, as I said earlier, we read a passage in our gathering, and it was simply a collection of verses. I went through parts of 10, 11, and 12 of Hebrews, and I pulled these verses that kind of gives you the broad paintbrush stroke picture of this section of Hebrews. So I encourage you to go back again. I encourage you to go back and read these chapters for yourself. But before we get into the heart of the text, I do want to look back at Hebrews 11, verse 1 one more time, just a little bit closely. And as I said, this was already in the email earlier this week on Tuesday, the prayer email. So if you did not get it or did not read it, I'm not going to judge you for it. There's other reasons I'm doing this. I'm hoping that it's a tool, but I understand it's not for everybody, okay? But there is a little bit more in depth, and it actually ties into the nature and idea of grace as well. Just a little bit. I just scraped a little bit of the iceberg with that. So go back and check that out. But I want to give you a quick summary, because if not, then this whole thing might be really confusing for you. For a long time, the common understanding and reading of Hebrews 11:1 left the idea of faith to be this abstract mental assent to a fact. In fact, when I was younger, I would ask, hey, how do you describe faith? What is faith? Like I'm trying to wrap my mind around this and I can't do it. And all the time, all I would get is people quoting the verse to me, which, to be completely honest and transparent with this, that was not helpful at all. That just made me more frustrated. And honestly, it made me think, you actually don't know. You're just regurgitating information. Now, I didn't think this as a young person, but now, knowing what I know now, I would say this. You're operating on the bare minimum level of blooms. You can memorize for the test and spit it out. That's doing you nothing. And it's actually doing more damage to the people around you than you think. So it didn't settle well with me, and it still doesn't, as you can tell. But I think the biggest reason why that's bothered me is because in matters of importance, abstract doesn't always help. It can, but I think it helps more as a supplement. Instead, I think in matters that are super important, when you're asking the life-changing questions that come from this topic, concrete is better. And we're not always gifted that. So we're not always given concrete. So please know that. I can't always give you concrete. But concrete is the way to go if you find it. And I honestly believe there is a credible, and this is not just a belief that's saying, I believe, so I'm going to share it with you. I've done a lot of digging on this, and there's a lot of scholars that have come out and said, actually, yes, this for a long time has been a credible alternative reading and understanding of Hebrews 11:1. And to me, it makes way more sense. And this is what it is. I'm actually going to read it from the New Living Translation today. And I think that's part of what I shared earlier with what we read together. But the reason I chose the New Living Translation is because of all the translations I use, I think it's one of the ones that makes this the most clear, to highlight this alternative understanding in a more concrete way. So this is what it says. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. So in case you need that explained another way, talking about faith, it itself is the evidence of things we cannot see. So rather than some abstract thought, faith is a concrete reality, that is tangibly seen and felt. not only by us, but by those around us. So much so that it in and of itself is so tangibly experienced and seen and felt that it serves as the best evidence for the existence, the activity, and the love of God himself. So, that's the summary. I could have done that in the email and you guys would have had a lot less reading to do. But if you jump into the heart of Hebrews 10 and 11, I think you notice a number of things that the Christians in that day, and then in chapter 11, the people in the Old Testament that the writer is bringing up. There's a number of things that they are experiencing and talking about that if we were in their position, we would be a little bit nervous and rightfully fearful. So how did they respond? Well, they responded through faith, because you fight fear through faith. So you could say with faith, yes, but I like the preposition through better because it implies movement. It's not just thinking, I believe in God. I think James would say, cool, kudos, so do the demons. He says that. So like I'm trying to emphasize the difference here. Faith is not just thinking something. It is not, because you can't tangibly see what a person's thinking. They can tell you, but they could be lying. So how is that evidence? Faith is active. Faith, and actually maybe a better way of wording this and talking about this, is faithfulness. Because all of a sudden with that word, a lot is implied with there. That there's a standard or a person to which you are acting, or for which you are acting for. For which you are acting. Prepositions, getting me all the time. Whatever. But here's the thing. Like the Israelites, before they were liberated out of Egypt, or when they were brought out of Egypt. Before they were liberated out of Egypt, we have been so conditioned by our former personified slave master, sin, that we often are more comfortable and prefer to return to and live in a restrictive framework that I'm going to borrow from an author and a pastor named Mike Glenn, a restrictive framework called no. In fact, I'll share a little excerpt for you. In his book, The Gospel of Yes, this is what he writes. Whenever I talk to people about hearing God's yes, they start to see the hope that lies in finally leaving behind their regrets and pain caused by their mistakes. But, there's always a but. Linguists, have noted that this conjunction possesses an interesting power. Whenever the word but is used, people tend not to remember anything that was said before it. For most of us, sin possesses the same kind of power. Sin is the great negation, the no that attempts to blot out the yes of Christ. Sure, Jesus loves you, but you're a sinner. And after the but, we forget everything else. Sin has a way of making us forget the goodness of God. Sin denies the presence and power of God in us and in our world. Sin tricks us into believing that it has more power than it really does. So here's my question. How has our former taskmaster, slave master, sin? Because, by the way, the reason I'm personifying this is because Paul does this in the book of Romans. So this is something that the scriptures do. But how has sin tried to hijack you and me as we are in this new chapter of Direction Church? I'm specifically pertaining to that because as we gather in a community, we're going to talk about community things. You can ask that question about other things. How has sin hijacked and tried to imprison you or bring you back into imprisonment and restrictiveness in other areas of your life? You can think about that too. But specifically as we have moving towards this next chapter of Direction Church, how has sin tried to hijack my faith and your faith, our collective community faith? I started to look up the number of times in the Bible. Actually, I skipped ahead. I'm sorry. For those Mike was talking about in that excerpt that I read, for those, the people that he was talking about, it hijacks them by bringing up mistakes from the past and the accompanying shame and guilt. And so I think for us, at least for me, what's happened is sin as the taskmaster personified, tries to bring up the old ways of doing things. And this is even more tricky because the old ways of doing things isn't necessarily bad, but it does keep me and keep us from doing the new things God's inviting us to. The whole purpose we started this residency was because we analyzed statistics that showed right now there is an increasing number of people leaving the church. The church is hemorrhaging out people, meaning that something is disconnected in our discipleship. Something is not genuine. Something is not working. We are probably more fixated in some places as a church as a whole on ourselves versus our Lord. And so we started this whole residency to intentionally learn and posture ourselves and do the uncomfortable things because we wanted to see that stat change. Not because of us, but because of Jesus. And so we entered this residency and now we're moving forward. And as we get closer, I don't know if you're feeling this. My hunch is yes, because it's just my hunch. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It doesn't bother me. But as we get closer, the more and more I feel the tug, the pressure from outside voices, the pressure from inside voices to, hey, just do this. This is easier and all the other churches are doing it. Versus, hey, we need to step out in faithfulness to Jesus, but also take some risks because here's a person that I know personally that will not step foot in a church building. Here's a person I know that will not step foot into a large group of people. But if you invite them into a smaller group of people to talk about Jesus and they feel like they are safe and they can ask questions, they'll do that. So how am I going to be faithful and go back into this, or am I going to be faithful and pursue the unknown? And try this. This is the stuff that is real. This is the tangible concreteness and why I'm talking about this here today. Because really, this isn't even new. It's not new at all. You can read throughout the entire Bible. God constantly tells his people not to fear. And this is what I was starting to say earlier. I looked up earlier, I tried to look up rather, how many times in the Bible God says, do not fear. And I've heard people share this stat and whatnot, and usually it's based upon English translations. So because when I looked it up, I got so many different answers. So I truthfully, I did not have time to go in and do the deep digging of looking up specific Hebrew phrases in the Old Testament with Aramaic phrases as well, just in case they're in Daniel. Excuse me, or Ezra as well. I think Ezra, anyway, it doesn't matter. Or even the Greek phrase in the New Testament. I didn't have time to do that, so that's my apology. But what I can say based upon the various numbers is that it's in there a lot. God tells his people, do not fear, do not be afraid, take heart, all of these things quite a bit. And what's really interesting, and I think we would do really well to put this to memory right now, is that more often than not, whenever God tells his people, do not fear, he also accompanies that with what he is doing now or what he is about to do. So just hold on. And the reason I want to share that is because I think that applies to our text here today in Hebrews. But before we get to that, it does remind me of Jesus' words in John chapter 16, verse 33. He says, I have told you this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have, past tense by the way, overcome the world. John later writes this in 1 John chapter 5. Everyone born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome. By the way, I'm going to preface this. The word even later on here is not in there. So I don't know why they added that. I think they were trying to make that clear, but it's actually more confusing. So here's what it is, okay? Everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world. Our faith. Fear is always a tactic of the enemy to make us shrink back from being a part of what God is doing. It's a powerful tactic. It's a power tactic, and it works. In our Hebrews text, there are people who belong to a group who shrink back. But then there's also a group of people who have faith or are faithful, who belong to a living treasure possession of God. And I'm going to go back and read this from Hebrews chapter 10, verse 39, but I'm going to read it from a different translation than we did earlier so you can see a little bit better what I'm talking about. And this is what it says, but we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. Now, I had a mentor in Tennessee, and And I really miss meeting with him. We would meet every week on Mondays, and we would study the Hebrew Scriptures together. Now, I get that Hebrews is in the New Testament. We also did some New Testament work, but he actually preferred translating this verse this way. And it's going to sound confusing, but I'm going to explain it. He said he prefers to explain it or translate it this way. But we are not of shrinkers back. So a group of people known as shrinkers back, okay, toward destruction, but of faithfulness toward living treasure or prized possession. In other words, those who shrink back are moving away from the source of life, God, and towards something that slowly sucks away their life until it eventually kills them. But those who stand in faith, who live in faithfulness, we read in the type of faith and faithfulness we read about in chapter 11, a faith that is faithful and is a witness. It serves as evidence to the reality of God, to his love, to his provision for his people. They continue toward God as right now, not in the future, but right now as a living prized possession, a living treasure. Now, if you remember me talking about the term segula at any time over the past almost 5 years now, this would be an appropriate time to insert that, okay? I'm not going to here because of time, but this would be a good time to do so. Notice though, but if you think back to that verse I just read in verse 39 of Hebrews 10, it did not say anything about one side experiencing fear and the other side not. I think both sides absolutely experience fear. Again, you can just go back. This is a lot of referencing for you to go read on your own. But go back in chapter 10 and you read a lot of the stuff that's going on. They have every reason to fear. Both sides are experiencing fear. But what is contrasted, and the difference is their response. Some shrink back and give in to fear. Others stand against it and endure through it. Now, think about that, and I'm going to read 3 verses from Hebrews 12. I'm going to reread them from our text earlier. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses, remember back to 11:1, a faith that is evidence, that testifies, that witnesses to the reality, proves to people that God does exist. So since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of people that do that, of witnesses to the life of faith, or maybe you can say with a life of faithfulness, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. Get rid of any residue of that old taskmaster, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. So, take a new grip with your tired hands and strengthen your weak knees. Mark out a straight path for your feet so that those who are weak and lame will not fall but become strong. Hebrews 11 is often referred to as the Hall of Faith, kind of a play on the term for Hall of Fame. And it is filled with examples of people who came face to face with fear, yet remained faithful. And so I'm going to end here today as I get ready to turn it over to your discussion groups with this. In the book of Revelation, John writes about the defeat of Satan. He writes about the defeat of the great accuser of God's people in Revelation chapter 12. And how does he say that our enemy is defeated? This is what he says, Revelation 12, verses 10 and 11. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. And hear this, they triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, by their witness, by their faithfulness, by their faith. They did not love their lives so much to, catch this, shrink from death. I pray that we as brothers and sisters will fight fear with the faithfulness of true faith. Not alone, together. However uncomfortable it may be, however difficult it may seem, may we stand in faith, fight fear, and live a life of true faith that proves to those around us that there is indeed a God who loves you, who loves me, and loves all of them.